Hi there. Welcome to Books for Believers, where we, two pastors, get to discuss important works of literature. Today, we're going to be discussing the book Wiseblood by Flannery O'Connor. And in order to prepare for that, we want to give you a short synopsis of the plot of this book. Dane, take it away.
Well, Flannery O'Connor's book, Wiseblood, it's a dark narrative that's character-driven. And so while it doesn't have a storyline that is able to be followed necessarily of conflict, climax, resolution, it does have within each one of these character arcs some very important stages and steps that these individuals take in their growth and even towards their death for some of these characters. But it starts, and the main character is Hazel Motes. It starts with him coming back from war, somewhat disenchanted with the world and the upbringing that he's had from a grandfather preacher and his whole family seeming to have already passed on, even though he's a young man. And he moves into this city all by himself, and really all he's got on his agenda is a bone to pick with God. And so he founds a church without Christ and goes on a mission to find an alternative Jesus, even though really at the core of his argument is that we don't need Jesus to begin with. And so the narrative theme of this, I think, is the exposition of the foolishness of the idea that we need anything but Jesus.
So join us for this discussion and examination of the important themes of the book Wiseblood by Flannery O'Connor. We hope that you enjoy it and that you're also edified by the time that we get to spend. Hi there. Welcome to Books for Believers. This is a podcast between my dear friend Dane and myself where we talk about good books, not just good Christian books, but great literature that has impacted the world beyond anything that we might be able to produce ourselves. So it's a great opportunity for us to dig into some of the important literature, both of our era and before, that has continued to shape worldview, both inside the church and without of the church. And we're excited to do so. I'm Pastor Brad Maston. I pastor Fort Collins Bible Church and work with Dane at True Grace Books. And I'll let Dane introduce himself now.
I'm Dane Rogers, pastor of Tacoma Grace Bible Church, and also work with Dr. Brad Maston at True Grace Books. I'm here in Tacoma, Washington, and excited to go on this journey of looking at some very significant pieces of literature throughout history, both Christian and secular.
So as we start our discussion, I think it's really important to answer that first question that some might be asking, which is, why should a Christian bother reading non-Christian books or secular books or just read in general outside of reading the Bible? What response would you give to that line of questioning, Dane?
I'd say the first thing that comes to mind is we happen to live in a world that's predominantly non-Christian. And though it's created by the Christian God, though it's got its point of termination in the kingdom of God, we still live in a world that is, I would say, plagued by non-Christian worldviews. And one of the best ways to understand that worldview is to look at how they create worlds within the fictional world.
Yeah, and adding to that, the reality is that people are created in the image of God, and thus they do something that naturally glorifies or responds to that tendency by creating. And so, in a way, just as I would argue that every piece of truly beautiful music honors God in a sense because he designed the world and us to make and appreciate music, so it is with reading great books. And whether that's the works of Dickens or, as we're going to talk about today, Flannery O'Connor, things that even might challenge or upset us are truly meaningful because they come forth from that response to what God has created us to be. And so we come to know, as you said, the worldview or certain things about maybe the culture that we live in, as well as something about being made in the image of God through it, moving through these creative visions and ideas and novels and poems.
Well, and to add to that, I can bring a great example. It's not the book we're discussing this afternoon, but Oscar Wilde, I would say, is just hated by Christians generally. mostly because of his very flamboyant lifestyle and very questionable choices. Uh, but he set out to write a book that was absolutely void of morals and morality. And what he ended up doing was writing a book that deals so importantly with morals and the question of vanity that you could almost read it side by side with the book of Ecclesiastes and wonder if that was his inspiration. But really, he's dealing with the world that God created through an unbiblical worldview, and he naturally comes to some very biblical conclusions. And that book is The Portrait of Dorian Gray.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. I mean, in reading Jack Kerouac's On the Road, we might think that we're getting a defense of a bohemian lifestyle or something like that. However, the reality is that we are getting a picture of the inner world and the hopelessness. If you read that book, it's not filled with romantic pictures of what their lifestyle was like. It's horrifying, and the emptiness and the hollowness of it is put on display for us to read and hopefully to be able to, as Christians, respond to and say, I see that person's need for hope. I see that need for Christ ultimately. And so I would say that there is great value in reading good literature, especially good literature, as Christians, because it prepares us and equips us to interact meaningfully with the world and understand their viewpoints that we might otherwise miss. But it's not just evangelistic; it also helps us understand, and as we're going to see, great books like Flannery O'Connor's *Wiseblood* and Moby Dick and others. Charles Dickens went to great lengths to criticize hypocrisy and problems that they saw in the church. And we don't need to shy away from that, like, publicists. We also recognize that there are problems in the visible expression of the body of Christ in the local church and church culture. And so we can respond with maturity and honesty to those criticisms and those complaints and say, yeah, absolutely. The amassing Christians and all that happens in Christian pop culture or subculture is not necessarily biblically defensible. In fact, we can gain great insight into our own shortcomings of faith by interacting with some of these meaningful and really well-meaning ideas, don't you think?
Well, I absolutely think so. And I think, especially looking towards Flannery O'Connor and some similar Christian authors, what it really does is it helps us to turn a critical eye towards quote unquote Christian culture,
Mm.
because that's the culture in which Christian fiction is really being developed and cultivated. While often we'll go into a Christian bookstore and we'll see books that are actually unbiblical, unchristian in their worldview, even. I used to work at a Christian bookstore, and the whole Amish fiction section we just called Christian smut because a lot of it is very inappropriate
Right.
uh, and more tantalizing, perhaps, than something like Fifty Shades of Grey.
Mm.
I wouldn't know because I've never read either one of them, but I have often seen how excited people get about them. And Flannery O'Connor is an interesting author because while being a critic of Christian culture, especially Christian culture in the Deep South and in her early 20th century setting, we've got a lot of parallels to our world today where we can turn that critical eye towards not necessarily the doctrines that we're learning in the church, but the way that we're acting in the world and what we call Christian. Uh, because a lot of it really is just culture.
Mm. Absolutely. So hopefully that's a reasonable defense and to start why this discussion happened. I will openly confess, and Dane, I think, would be with me on this. We love literature. We love books. In a way, even things that were created to be critical of Christians or critical even of God or an ideology inevitably are using God's resources to attack him. And therefore, we do have a great appreciation for the thought and the exploration and even the honesty when it becomes uncomfortable to us that's there. And it's been a lifetime passion for myself and for Dane, both as authors and as readers, to be informed by this. So hopefully, with that in mind, we can turn our gaze to our book of the day. Our book of the day that we're going to be studying this month, or talking about this month, is Wiseblood by Flannery O'Connor. Of course, Flannery O'Connor is a rather interesting, in fact, a very interesting figure in American literature, and I would love to turn it over to Dane to give us some background on who she was and what she represents in the Western literary canon.
Well, Flannery O'Connor is one of my favorite authors, and she's been a favorite ever since probably I was 16 years old or so and read Good Country People and A Good Man is Hard to Find. Both of those are just incredible short stories, and she deals very well with some Southern culture and um, that Southern charm, you might say, tongue in cheek. She was kind of a master of the Gothic style, though. And so while she paints these beautiful pictures of the South, she deals with some very dark topics. And I think that's why Christians often shy away from her. And of course, they find credence to do this because she was a devout Catholic, not a devout Protestant. And so we tend to try to just kick her to the curb. But she's necessarily turning a very critical eye, as we've mentioned, towards that um, both Catholic and Protestant culture down in the Deep South. And so in Wise Blood, she's looking at the street preachers and snake oil preachers and big tent revival preachers, and I think wondering what is the genuine there. So I think a good question can really be asked about this book is, while we're not trying to focus on Christian fiction, this might very well be Christian fiction.
We must say, right? Certainly regarded herself as a believer, and like we can, we're not going to split hairs in this instance, right, between a Catholic believer or a Protestant believer per se, but that core conviction, as she said herself in the note to the second edition, she said, Wiseblood was written by an author congenitally innocent of theory, but one with certain preoccupations. That belief in Christ is to some a matter of life and death has been a stumbling block for readers who would prefer to think it a matter of no great consequence. And I love this quote because it points out that she beholds what I think most of us see is a bunch of nominal Christians who will say or proclaim a Christianity, but when it comes to really impacting action or thought or how they run their lives, she doesn't see it. And I think we can say that's true in any age. So again, whether or not she was saved, I don't know. Whether what her eternal destiny was, I certainly don't know. But we do know that she was troubled by the things that she saw within the church, and we would be troubled by them too.
I think so. Well, and she had kind of an outsider looking in perspective too, because while she was part of the Catholic Church down in the South, she was pretty much confined to her home for congenital illness. And so she ended up dying at the very early age of 39 with only two books and a handful of short stories to her name, but yet they were all so impactful that they've made a name for her along the greats who have hundreds and thousands of titles. Also, interestingly, she was a peacock farmer. So most
I
of her
did not know
books,
that.
some sort of peacock imagery on the front to kind of give a a nod towards her second great passion um, after literature. So a woman of the South and a woman of culture, but a woman of a very interesting and unique taste.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had no idea that that was the case. She often gets described as grotesque or Southern Gothic style. These are words that might draw up a certain set of images. You know, William Faulkner wrote in the style, as well as other great authors that come forth from the American South. And I really do think that there's some reason to pause and recognize that the art that came out of the South, particularly after the Civil War in this Reconstruction era of oppression, difficulty, poverty, right, that was imposed upon them by as the result of losing the war, basically. We've got a rich environment wherein poverty and oppression, and of course, this historic racism and slavery, and all of these things come together because they are all living in the same community. And it brings about some really troubling or disturbing images. And one of the things that makes Flannery O'Connor so unique is that she's not going to shy away from what's gross or what's shocking to us just because it's shocking to us, right? She's going to show reality in a way that is as alarming as reality often is, which fulfills the function of true art. But what do you think of in her relationship to Southern culture and specifically that Gothic style?
Well, I think that really does hit the nail on the head. That I'd say the term grotesque, and that obviously is going to be a term that people are going to hear and think, well, then why do I want to read her books? Well, she's dealing with the grotesque that exists, and it's necessarily going to be around us, but watching her deal with it and point it out is somewhat healing, actually.
Mm.
Um, I know we're going to talk a lot, I'm sure, about Hazel Motes and Asa Hawks, two of the characters in her books. But she's got some good side characters too, and one that I just found fascinating is Enoch Emery. In fact, although he is apparently a side character, it's his side quest that really gives the book its name, Wiseblood, because that was something that his dad would always tell him that he needs to have wise blood. It's just something you're born with. It's something you have innately or you don't. And so Enoch is kind of obsessed with this image and the idea of respect. Though as you meet this character, you see there's not really much to respect about him. Um, he's very much caught up in his own little world, and his quest ends up being just a search for respect. And oddly enough, he finds this man in a gorilla suit that is receiving the respect that he thinks he deserves, or that he would like to acquire for himself, and he goes to very odd lengths to acquire that, and finds out that you can't just take it. Um, so I'd say they're just fascinating character stories that are so colorful and vibrant that they really stick with you. These are characters um, that kind of take humanity to the next extreme, and I think expose more what's going on in our heads, but we have the filters not to take to their logical extremes in reality. She pushes those characters to those logical extremes. So we see that the childishness and immaturity pushed into adults, and it becomes quite zany at times. So perhaps a grotesque zany is her style.
Well, and I think that is the easy thing to miss in the grotesque style. We talk about having a dark sense of humor, and really, in the face of reality and suffering, it's one of the ways that humans can deal with or respond to things that we just dislike or disapprove of or even are appalled by dealing with it through humor. And it's important to recognize as you're reading this book that it is meant to be obscenely humorous, right? It is funny, but I think a lot of times as we're reading it, we kind of get that dark humor moment of, am I allowed to laugh at this? And the answer is, you're supposed to laugh at us. It's supposed to be absurd because reality is very frequently absurd, especially the further one gets from the truth of Christ and the truth of the biblical worldview. And so as she explores that, right, it can be difficult for us to see these, like you said, zany characters like Enoch and Hazel, and Hazel's a little bit less zany and more just tragic, but still the reader is meant to identify the absurdity of what's going on, and I think she chuckled while writing it.
Oh, I would imagine so. She seems to be that kind of dark humorist who just loves putting these characters in these situations and figuring out how they're going to um, not get out of them, but abuse the situation and find themselves even more deeply entrenched in the pit that they tried to save themselves from. And I, of course, think of Hazel Motes when it comes to this, where he sees the street preacher blind on the side of the street and wants to show him up and start preaching a different gospel, a church without Christ. And in the end, he ends up in very much the same exact situation as Asa Hawks, the blind street preacher. Um, so I think this tragic character, Hazel, really is part of her critique of trying to run from God and create a Christianity that is really void of Christ.
Well, by the design of the of Hazel Motes, and it's again, it just drips with literary irony, especially once you know it. So one of the things, if you haven't yet read this book, which by the way I would say you should, it's an interesting book. While there might be some things that scandalize you to one degree or another, they're not celebrated as such, and I think that's important. Is that while Flannery O'Connor deals with very real tragedies of human life and even sinful and flagrantly sinful actions, right? That she's not celebrating it. She's in fact using it in a very moral sense to say that this meaningfully scandalizes us, right? So in that regard, I think we can point out, and we really must point out, that you really have to get on Flannery O'Connor's page to appreciate what she's doing. The first time I read this book, I have to admit, I walked away going, "What was that?" There's no way he actually put on a monkey suit, like, and the dealing with the little idol the little shrunken man that he follows. This is Enoch, of course, but the events of the book seem so absurd. You almost wonder if she's narrating a dream or if there's not reality, and you really have to jump into this this wacky world and say, okay, she said that happened, right? And especially as we get into the conclusion of Hazel Mote's tale, there's a lot of things that you go, no, 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 not literally, right? No, literally, she meant it, right? And so, if you're not on that page, if you're not expecting it to be as wacky and bizarre and shocking, striking as it is, as I was expecting a serious book about racism or something, and did not get what I anticipated, and therefore, the first time I read it, did not enjoy it to the degree that the consequent three, four, five times I've read it, I've loved it, but that's a really difficult thing about anything you're reading, right? Is that if you don't get what you expect, you wind up not liking it because, you go to take a big glass of Coke and find out it's milk. Well, you might love milk, but you were expecting Coke, right? So, Coca-Cola, of course. So you got this situation where, coming to Flannery O'Connor, we have our ideas about what she probably is like. I mean, to me, I thought of her in terms of a relationship to Kill a Mockingbird, right? And To Kill a Mockingbird, also written from a Southern perspective, from this beautifully written landmark importance. But I was looking for not a sequel, but something in step with that. To find out you got something totally different, right, took some adjustment. So hopefully, if you're planning on reading this, you can reset some of those expectations and be ready to encounter not the warm moral environment of To Kill a Mockingbird, but rather this new wild world that really accurately describes, especially within kind of the lower intellectual classes of humanity, the people who aren't very smart, but they're running around with these huge ideas about God, about Christ, about how to live life, and yet they don't possess the wherewithal. Both Enoch and Hazel, I'd say, are pretty remarkably unintelligent and totally undereducated. And that's what makes them so interesting, right? Is that they're dealing with things that are so far past what they're really intellectually capable or educationally trained to deal with, but they're still the realities of life. And so it brings about some uncomfortable situations that I just love in that regard.
We had two things come to mind as you mentioned that, and one is she appears to have throughout the whole book this sustained metaphor for each of the characters individually. For Enoch, who's just seeking status, uh, she ends up having him literally put on a monkey suit in order to go after that status. Uh,
Which,
and
by the
this
way, I just have to insert, if you haven't read it yet, his primary pastime is going to the zoo and making fun of the monkeys. Like, he hates the monkeys because they're so stupid. And so anyway, it's just so beautiful.
It's absolutely beautiful. The way that she weaves this, the way, and I don't know, like I've never met a guy like this, but yet I know him. Uh,
Right?
and when he puts on that monkey suit, it's like everything clicks. What he was going to make fun of was really what he sought to be. But really, he just sought to be in that position. Um, and then with Hazel. we start out the story with him thinking about his impending death, essentially, and fearing it, and thinking of all of his family members who have died and the weird things that they said to him before their death, and his not wanting to be closed in the dark train cubby because it's a lot like a coffin, and so struggling to get out of that darkness. But what we end up getting is um, Hazel locked permanently in blindness, and then Mrs. Flood, his landlady, I think really coining the sustained metaphor of the blind leading the blind.
Hmm.
Uh, Hazel, in an effort to one up Asa Hawks, ended up following in his footsteps. And then here we've got Mrs. Flood um, following Hazel into his blindness.
Mm.
Uh, it's it's the blind leading the blind and the monkey suit pursuit of status and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's shift slightly because we can't talk about this novel without talking about the characters, and the characters really do drive the action in this case. You get inside of each of the characters in a really profound way. So, starting with Hazel Motes, one of the things that first confused me is that Hazel's a girl's name. But not here. Hazel Motes is, as was previously mentioned, he is someone who grew up from a typical Southern religious background. His grandpa was a preacher, so he kind of feels the weight of that. And yet, at the same time, we get the impression or the understanding that he went off to war with sort of a positive view of religion or the spirituality of his past and his background. We'll talk about some of the flaws with that, I hope, as we go forward. But kind of you get the sense that he saw things, as many do on the battlefield, that it was just irreconcilable. So then he comes back to with a good God, with a loving God, and all of the things that bring challenge for that. So now we see him weirdly attached to his past as a descending from religious people, and particularly a traveling preacher, and yet also having rejected God and rejected Christ. In fact, there's a really interesting quote that he says when we first meet him. He says, speaking to a lady on the train, "Do you think I believe in Jesus?" He said, leaning toward her and speaking almost as if he were breathless. "Well, I wouldn't, even if he existed, even if he was on this train." So you get this idea that he's already there and already struggling with this, right? Because of his relationship to his grandfather. And I just have to share this quote as well. It says, his grandfather had been a circuit preacher, a waspish old man who had ridden over 3 counties with Jesus hidden in his head like a stinger, right? What incredible imagery here, and that negative picture of these circuit riding preachers that were so really poisonous, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So Hazel is this picture of a person who has become disenfranchised with what he really didn't know, and it's really categorized in this one point. It says the boy didn't need to hear it. This is him speaking about hearing about Jesus in his youth. The boy didn't need to hear it. There was already a deep, black, wordless conviction in him that the way to avoid Jesus was to avoid sin. So we see he got the gospel narrative turned entirely on its head. It's essentially Jesus is coming to get you if you sin, but if you don't sin, Jesus, God will stay away from you, and you can, be at peace or live your life apart from him. So,
Well, to the very end, that's really the line that he continues to push. Actually, what I'd like to say is that shifts into I need no redemption. Blood never did anything for me, and that's kind of the play with the wise blood thing. Is Enoch's got his wise blood, but where does it get him? And Hazel's playing with the motif of the assumption that Christ's blood does nothing to him, to the point where he says, show me exactly where it cleanses you."
mhm.
He's got this very carnal view of the spiritual world. And so he comes to the conclusion, I don't need no cleansing. I'm already clean. But then you see him doing the dirtiest things, riding in the dirtiest car and calling that car beautiful and clean and perfect. And anyone who wants to look at it and tell him just how trash his car is, all he's got to tell him is, no, it's a perfect car. No one's ever had such a good car as I have. So we've got this obvious cognitive dissonance where he's got this awful, ugly beater broken down car that barely works, and he's saying it's perfect, it's clean, it's doesn't need anything. And then you've got him on this other side where he's saying, I'm perfect, I'm clean. And you realize he is his car.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really the climax of the book, which I hope you've paused the recording and read at this point, because this is a bit
Spoiler.
of a spoiler alert. But at the very end, when the policeman pushes the car off the cliff and his car is destroyed and blown into bits, he walks himself back to town and blinds himself, and that's just the end of it for him. When
Mm,
his car is gone, when that symbol of a perfect tragedy is gone, his life becomes a perfect tragedy.
hmm. Yeah. So, at at the risk of shortchanging, hopefully we'll get to return to a lot of these themes. But Enoch Emery is, as we've already mentioned, such a masterpiece in caricature. I mean, it's almost Dickens level idiosyncrasies that you're connected to. But how would you introduce Enoch Emery to our audience in a way that would be meaningful?
Well, I love the way that she describes him, his kind of gangly and greasy appearance with his, I think it's a or a yellow suit with green trim, and blonde hair that's greased up. And he just latches on to Hazel from the very beginning. He sees Hazel preaching and he's like, that's the guy who I'm going to follow, because really this guy who's just seeking for status is looking for someone to follow. And he goes to these wild lengths to find a new Jesus for Hazel. So he's in search of just something to gain the approval of this person who he has no reason to seek his approval. And so I would say he's impulsive. He is he is not lacking in motivation, but his motivation is definitely placed in the wrong place. And we don't really know, at least I can't recall if there's a good ending for him. I think it just kind of peters out in that way that you would expect this search for status to go. Nothing really comes of it, but you see him acting a ridiculous pantomime in order to gain it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think Enoch is a really fascinating character because he is universally despised. And it's fun because, Hazel comes to town and Enoch starts to act like his guide. And I would love to, think about the various relationships, especially in terms of the biblical context that is being invoked. I mean, I think Hazel's kind of a John the Baptist figure, right?
Yeah.
And it is really interesting how, the other characters react. But Enoch, at least initially, is trying to be that first disciple, right?
Mhm.
Even though Hazel also seems to hate Enoch. He
Yes.
gets disrespected by everyone around him, and all he seems to want is to be approved, loved, accepted. And yet he says, everybody in this town's awful, everyone in this town's mean because they're mean to him because quite frankly, he doesn't fit he's not useful to anyone, right? And so he's an interesting figure as he is just tremendously stupid, like
Yeah.
just a not intelligent, not educated person who's been brushed to the wayside. And yet he finds that whatever degree of acceptance that is better than how everyone else is treating him in this
Mhm.
hardened, angry Hazel Motes, has really no positive regard for him.
But I think that brings up a good point, because both you and I have spent time in Eastern cultures where respect is really kind of a baseline for the culture,
Mhm.
especially in certain social scenarios where a customer and worker, a relationship really is one of deep respect. And we see really the epitome of like the last straw for Enoch is that the woman who's serving him food and who he's paying money to serve him doesn't even have enough respect to want him in her establishment to give him the food that he's just ordered, where he orders and she says basically, why don't you just get out of here? Go
Yeah.
somewhere else. I don't want your business, kind of thing. And you get the sense that he's done nothing
Mhm.
technically to gain this disrespect either. But no matter where he goes, he's just plain hated. Mhm.
Absolutely. And again, that's the lack of social graces. Is it the lack of intelligence? Whatever it is, he is an outcast entirely not of his own doing. He's not, involved in any criminal behaviors, at least initially. You don't get the sense that, like you said, that there's a conscious choice. It's pointing out the hard culture that seems to immediately assess someone's worth or value specifically to me or to the person who's assessing,
Mhm.
and then cast someone aside because they'll never be valuable to me. And that is not a biblical culture at play, is it? Like here's this huge Christianized culture. Everyone believes, everyone goes to church, or at least in the caricature that she's painting, and yet Enoch, this poor dumb guy, cannot find any love, any approval, any, sense of someone willing to take him under his wing or anything. He's just totally alone in this world. So that brings us to the next major character in my mind is the Hawks, both Asa and Lily, and
Mhm.
Sabbath Lily, I should say. And how would you introduce the Hawks to us?
Well, Asa Hawks is a disenchanted street preacher. He's still out there doing his preaching. It appears to be lucrative enough that he continued to do it. But we find out somewhere around the first third of the book that he's kind of lost the oomph in his step two, and we find out that really it came from a deep place of feeling as if he were let down by God
Hmm.
because he expected a promise that wasn't really a promise from God to materialize. And so he tried to play God, and God didn't let him be God. And in the end, he ends up blind for it. And really, that's what Hazel's doing too. So he serves as a foreshadow, I think, of Hazel's end, but also a foil to who Hazel is. He is the father of Sabbath Lily, uh, and she seems to basically just be willing to follow whichever one is maintaining the dream.
Hmm.
Um, Whichever one maintains the fiction, she's going to follow after them. And in the end, she's deserted by both.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think Asa is a really interesting figure because as you follow through his story, right, had this big moment where for the gospel he was going to blind himself with lie, only to find out later. And so he got some press, got some response from that, only to find out later he didn't. Like he's not actually blind, he's just pretending to be blind. So you have this theoretically Christian preacher who clearly has given up any authenticity or integrity for essentially selling an image that will work to get some donations on the street corner, right? So he is a beautiful and ugly, right, grotesque picture of at the ground level, at the base level, trying to capitalize financially upon people's religious affections. So that's that guy. He was so extreme. He took lye, right, this caustic powder, and he blinded himself, and he walks around acting blind and being led around by his daughter. Um, but again, seemingly has really no fidelity to her. And as we get into her as a character, she is such a complex character because you find at first she looks like she's very devout, but in reality, she's totally utilitarian because that's what's been shown to her, right?
But I just have to wonder too if Flannery chose the method of blinding being lie for a very specific reason. I wouldn't say she gives us enough evidence in there to think that that's why she did it. But there's many ways to blind yourself. But lies tend to be, I think, the most blinding. And both of them were willingly believing lies and ended up blind. And Sabbath Lily's following along. And she is very utilitarian to the point where it seems, and I think it brings up an interesting discussion that perhaps we'll have a little bit of time to dig into on the way that Flannery treats the women in her novels and short stories, but especially here in Wiseblood. We have three main female characters. The brothel worker at the very beginning, Sabbath Lily in the middle, and Mrs. Flood at the end. And all three have a very similar power dynamic with Hazel Motes, to where they are the brothel worker less so than the other two. They're beholden to Hazel for certain status and relationship, but in the end, they're really the ones that have a lot of power over him. where he's put himself in this struggle for power between the female and male. And I think it becomes apparent that Sabbath Lily just kind of wants something stable,
Mhm.
but she's willing to go to very unstable means to grasp at that stability. And so I think it perhaps is a critique and a commentary um, on femininity in the South and how it's a and often an entirely giving up of yourself in order to follow the man over the cliff into evil and sin, even if it might be. I mean, some classic tales from the South come to mind of the husband and wife team that are able to commit a lot more evil together than apart. Uh, and she's just willing to go along with whomever, but um, then really noticing that lack of self-respect that Sabbath Lily has comes from her pedigree
Mm.
and the lack of inherent familial status based on her being born out of wedlock. And
Mhm.
so I think just that great critique of when Christian culture is taken to unbiblical extremes, and those whom Jesus would have been the first to go out and draw into the fold are really the ones kicked onto the curb and sent into the devil's camp because of it. Um,
Mm.
we're really doing an injustice by treating people so poorly
Mm.
because not for biblical reasons, but for cultural reasons.
Absolutely. But I'd love to also bring to the front that Connery O'Connor's character names are chosen with such incredible intentionality, right? So you got Hazel Motes, right? First of all, Hazel is it has a meaning of vision and obscurity, right? So his blindness already put forth in his name, right? His future, actually his current blindness, spiritually speaking, and his future blindness at the climax of the story, we could say. But Motes being the allusion to the mote or the speck in someone's eye, right? So if we go back to King James, which would have been the type of English that she would have encountered the Bible in, you have someone who has sees a speck in their brother's eye and tries to pull it out, but in fact has this mote, this big plank in their own eye. So Hazel is introduced as a blind person with a plank in his eye. It's already there. And then similarly with Enoch Emery, right? Enoch is an allusion to the person in the Bible who, prior to the flood, was so righteous he walked with God and God took him. So it's like in inverse because Enoch is obviously ungodly, but that he's searching and that he's there, and actually might even allude to the kind of his disappearance or non-ending of his story. And then emery being an abrasive thing, like an emery board is used for filing nails. And boy, did he, well, yeah, he's abrasive in every way. So, and the Hawks, I'm curious to think what you hear about both Asa and Lily Hawks and the reason why their names were chosen, and this flood for that matter.
I don't have a good answer for that. I
Well,
haven't looked up any of those names, but um, yeah, I don't know. Sabbath Lily seems to be a little bit more apparent, but again, a little ironic. She appears at first to be a very delicate and dainty, but you find out very quickly she's pretty hardcore uh, and
yeah,
anything but a lily. And the irony of having her named after a sanctified and sacred day um, really twists her character on its head when you see that she definitely doesn't deserve the name that she has.
yeah. And it's interesting because I feel like she is constantly looking for rest. She is
Mm.
trying to find rest with Asa, and he's abusive and at least ignores her. And then she goes to Hazel, and she's dedicated to helping him and trying to get on board or whatever, be protected by her, even moving into his house without his permission, and yet she won't go. Right? I feel like she's constantly seeking after that Sabbath rest and never finding it, but accepting the little she can get, tragically.
Well, and I mean that brings up then the I think a very climactic point in her storyline, which draws in a character who's not really a character, and that is the shriveled Jesus, uh, which
If you haven't read it yet, you,
the first time I read this book, I think that's about the time I put it down, not because I was offended by any means, but just because it's like, what is going on? I can't figure out what's going on. Uh, but this shriveled critter, human or whatnot, I don't know if uh, I'm sure it's something that they're familiar with down in the South, those kinds of Creole shrunken head things. We've got one here in Washington State down at Jake's Museum in Long Beach, Washington, and it's this alligator that they've put some shrunken human head on, and it's a blasphemy. I mean, that's what
it's abominable.
it's supposed to be exactly that. But Hazel has been on this search for a Jesus figure for his church without Christ. He needs a different Jesus. And so Enoch, of course, being the lackey that he is, goes in this search to find another Jesus, and he finds it. He finds it at this dank little museum behind the zoo that he works at. And and he takes Hazel there one day to see it, and Hazel is entirely not interested. Um,
Right.
Mostly just not interested in Enoch because he's got to go find the Hawks. But eventually, Enoch acquires this shrunken thing, and he's hidden it in a gilded box that he feels led by God to have made and prepared ahead of time before he even knew what was going to go in it. And he keeps it for a very short time before bringing it over um, to Hazel, but it's not Hazel who receives it, it's Sabbath Lily. And I think she recognizes the importance that this thing should have to Hazel. But her desperate attempts to have something to connect herself to him with, that she has taken this figure. So it really becomes a frail and easily disintegratable um, object of worship for everybody. Um, but then the one thing that Hazel's looking for, even that, he ends up entirely disregarding. So that in the end, he really ends up with nothing. Even what he was looking for, which was foolishness, he ends up throwing that out the window and has just himself and his blindness.
Absolutely. And I think that that is, well, it's a little obscure because of the great, excellent quality of the writing, right? It doesn't just give up its treasures right away. The things that we think, and because we'll be so offended by some of the things that Hazel Mote says, and other people say, and the constant pictures of these uh, religious charlatans, right? We can think that this is just an all-out attack upon Christianity, but really, what it's giving us is a clear picture that apart from Christ, there's nothing to worship and a life of emptiness, right? And so you get all the characters ultimately shortchanged, blinded, fallen apart, or in a monkey suit because they have been so misdirected towards things apart from Christ, which I feel like we need to give adequate treatment to the concept of the church without Christ because it's a shocking and necessarily intentionally shocking perspective of what's going on in the context of the book. So would you please explain, hopefully not too evangelistically, the nature of the church without Christ?
Well, yeah, certainly not evangelistically. Even Hazel kind of struggles to be too evangelistic with it because he's got all these notions of what it should be and shouldn't be, and he's, for example, not willing to have somebody monetize this for him. Um, but essentially, it's whatever is opposed to Christ, that's what the church should be. I think he's got this chip on his shoulder about Jesus and his innate sense of that really is the central point of responsibility where uh, if I am clean, I don't need Jesus. If I need Jesus, that means I'm not clean. And of course, the point of the blood takes an important role in this story. And so, in order to have a church in which he's not responsible, he needs to get rid of Jesus. He needs to get rid of the Christ figure. And so he wants the religion and the religiosity, but he wants it to be vacant of Christ. And again, I think that is just Flannery's perfect analogy there of modern day Christendom, where we want the religiosity, we want the works and the feel good, the like Hazel's willing to go to extreme lengths to do the work, but he's unwilling absolutely to receive any portion of Christ in that to the point where Mrs. Flood finds rocks and glass and stuff in his shoes that he walks on every day so that he can take on the punishment himself rather than allow Christ to have any portion in it. So it really is a fool's errand. But I think Flannery is looking at a lot of the Christian culture around and saying, we're trying to do all the work here. We don't want Christ to really have any part of it, and we end up being little devils in the process.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, when we think about all that Christ represents to Hazel Motes, right, that's already disturbing because he has such a biblically uninformed view. But I echo that sentiment that she sees or has Hazel preaching what she sees, and I think we could all say we see at some level in the church, we see a church that is trying to, meet social needs or become attractive so they can gain followership or members and the centrality of Christ. He might be raised up as a set of magic words. He might be raised up as a symbol to rally around. But in terms of the actual impact that the grace and forgiveness of Christ represents biblically, is hauntingly absent from so many so-called Christian or church movements, right? And that uh, plays out in that picture of Hazel now recognizing that he has sin to deal with. He has problems, but he has no way, no person to provide that forgiveness. So he gets to his own absolution through basically self-torture, right? I mean, he's wrapping barbed wire around himself. He's walking on shoes filled with glass. He's blinded himself. All of these horrible actions that he's doing himself really as a response to the the sin that he can't cope with, right? That is his intellectual system has no way to deal with.
Um, I did look up the name Asa. It means healer.
Oh my. And I always thought the name hawks had a sense of a bird of prey, someone that you're looking out for. A hawk is something that is gonna might be beautiful, but appears just to carry on, just to, take what other people have done.
Hmm.
And I think Mrs. Flood is a very interesting um, uh, connotation. What with the biblical flood being what wipes away and washes away sin. Here she is at the end of the book as the unlikely recipient of this insane, self-tortured Hazel Motes. And at first, she seems to be trying to get something out of him, but by the end, she seems to be just be the only one who's willing to care for him at great personal expense. She winds up being, not in any spiritual sense, kind of his salvation. Otherwise, he would have just popped off and died if it wasn't for this Mrs. Flood is going to kind of come and wash him away in a way.
Yeah. In the end, she couldn't really be a salvation to him, though.
No.
But I think, yeah, I'm still wrestling with that one exactly. What is going on in their dynamic, or what's Flannery trying to show us with their dynamic? Because she does start off as somebody taking advantage and growing in her taking advantage of Hazel, but in the end, she seems willing to give up everything she has to follow him. And it makes you wonder what is that draw that he has, and what is it about him that I think people are drawn to, of the self-flagellating monk. Um, what exactly about human nature seeks after that sort of tortured soul, not out of or not to draw them back into society and help them become stable, but rather to follow them in their misery.
And I wonder, I mean, not necessarily presuming upon what Flannery O'Connor was trying to communicate, but I think we are always drawn to authenticity. I mean,
Mhm.
Asa, while he spoke more accurately about Jesus and about traditional church beliefs, right, was an absolute hoax. And
Mhm.
while Hazel was absolutely wrong, absolutely misguided, did not see things clearly, was self-righteous, he was authentic. Like you said, he was willing to do the work when it came to the point of his belief of self-punishment as being the way of some sense of salvation. He was the one willing to harm himself. And I think the really vivid picture that we get of that is in the false evangelist who attaches his cart to Hazel Motes in terms of now trying to popularize the Church Without Christ movement. And of course, Hazel finds himself absolutely appalled by it, but he's successful. He's able to sell a church without Christ that draws people. People want to listen to him because he's got his guitar and he's got a fun song and he's promising, I was so unhappy, but then after I learned about the church without Christ, I was so happy. And here's Hazel Motes just miserable in and of himself, going, you can't hijack my message. But he absolutely did.
Being honest, though, Hazel is being honest about the logical conclusions of his belief system. He's not promising happiness. He's not promising this. He's just promising um, a sort of freedom that isn't really freedom, but at least it's a different kind of slavery than slavery to Christ, I guess. But the other guy is honestly just taking Hazel's foolishness and treating it as if it's happiness. And I think Hazel more than anyone realizes this isn't happy. It's just the only alternative to Jesus.
Mhm.
Uh, and the guy who monetizes tries to have his cake and eat it too. And I think that scandalizes Hazel. Like, no, you can't have Jesus and not have Jesus. It's one or the other.
Well, and again, I think he recognizes he represents that even if what Hazel is pretending or bringing forth is authentic in some sense or any sense, even if it's an accurate definition of reality, that there will always be a salesman who comes up after and says, "Hey, this way, this product is going to bring you personal happiness because that's what people buy, right?" And so, just as we see that, in the Christian world, it's a point, and in Christianity as being for centuries, especially since the American Christianity has grown into the picture and commercialized Christianity to such a great degree, it's not come to Jesus for salvation. It's come to Jesus because he'll make your life happier, right? And so the thought that, well, Hazel went out to specifically defy that commercial and those empty promises, and I would say that they are empty promises. If you're joining or looking to trust in Christ for your own personal happiness or benefit, then you haven't understood the greater picture of what the faith, the biblical faith, is about. It's about him and his glory, and our suffering even brings him glory. And yet for Hazel to recognize that this charlatan, who then even gets a false Hazel Motes and stands him up and says, "Oh, well, now this is the guy," right? He realizes that he will be replaced by someone who can sell it better, and ultimately that his philosophy will be buried and meaningless.
Mhm. Well, and the irony of that is that's exactly what they're doing to the biblical prophets. They're taking their position within the society and twisting it, contorting it, and changing it to their own self-seeking desires. The guy who seeks to monetize it isn't the first one successful. He's just got different motives than Hazel.
Mhm.
Hazel's successful in his motives. His motives is really to disenfranchise people, to have them turn away from Christ. He just has this bone to pick, probably because of his upbringing in the war that he's just encountered and his natural human rebellion. The other guy doesn't seem to have that bone to pick. He just wants to make a buck. And uh, Asa seems to have his pride tied in with it. Um, but ultimately, in the end, you see all of them um, losing what little success they had. I mean, the false prophet in Hazel's spot. I mean, kind of all he wanted to do was make a little money for his family, and Now what
Gets run
position
down for his
left
troubles.
him, right? Like that's a tragic ending. But
Yeah, it
and he
sure is.
seems entirely unwitting to the whole plot and plan too. But I kind of look at that and think it's the ironic twist to the Enoch and Hazel story. This is what Enoch and Hazel could have been. No matter which way you swing it, it's a tragic ending.
Mm. Absolutely. Well, we're certainly at the end of our allotted time that we'd planned to spend on this and have left so much on the table. So, might I encourage you, if you are bold and brave, to pick up a copy of Wise Blood and read it, and please do leave comments on whatever fashion that you wherever you're encountering this, or reach out to us because we would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. But if we were to close this time with a statement about the major themes or importance, or even just what was most striking to you about this book in retrospect, how would you describe that?
Well, I would say that, just jumping off of the title here, you're born with wise blood or you're not, but we're all born with a need for the blood. And
Mm,
we're all born with an inherent need for Christ. And I think that's really where the only option that Flannery leaves you at the very end. Everything is vanity except for Christ. And so I think it's a very redemptive book. Although the themes are dark, they deal with some very challenging cultural issues and religious issues. In the end, she leaves you with the only option available, which is the authentic Christ.
amen. Yeah, that's an outstanding summary to which I will add nothing, but we'll invite our listeners to interact however you can. We would love to hear what book we should read next or should talk about next. We're happy to do that, and please stay tuned for more podcasts, more information. We'll look at poetry and other works of literature. And thank you so much for joining us for this time.